or at least
You want answers?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You want answers?
You have offended my family.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth.
And you have offended the Shaolin Temple.
You can't handle the truth.
surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Radical Rant.
Let's talk about marijuana. Not the plant itself, although we do have some of that. But let's talk about the word marijuana. Where exactly did it come from? This is a question that was asked by National Public Radio in their piece called The Mysterious History of Marijuana. And it's something that we've gone over a few times here on the Russ Belville Show and prior incarnations of this show, but it was time that we discussed it again. Primarily, the shorthand story that most people will tell you is that marijuana is a Mexican slang term for cannabis, and it was used to demonize the plant in the early 20th century in order to fool people who were well familiar with cannabis into voting against it, because it was the evil Mexican marijuana. And while that it has a grain of truth to it, has a large degree of truth to it, actually, there are a whole lot of other factors that sometimes get lost in this story that I thought might be interesting to go over. Now, of course, the Mexican part of this is pretty easy to divulge. Eric Schlosser wrote about this in Reefer Madness. This is a quote from his book. The political upheaval in Mexico that culminated in the Revolution of 1910 led to a wave of Mexican immigration to states throughout the American Southwest. The prejudices and fears that greeted these peasant immigrants also extended to their traditional means of intoxication, smoking marijuana. Police officers in Texas claimed that marijuana incited violent crimes, aroused a lust for blood, and gave its users superhuman strength. Rumors spread that Mexicans were distributing this killer weed to unsuspecting American school children. Sailors and West Indian immigrants brought the practice of smoking marijuana to port cities along the Gulf of Mexico. In New Orleans, newspaper articles associated the drug with African Americans, jazz musicians, prostitutes, and underworld whites. The marijuana menace, as sketched by anti-drug campaigners, was personified by inferior races and social deviants, end quote. And that's kind of the story that we've all heard about marijuana. Is it basically around 1910, 1920, the Mexicans are pushing into the country. You couldn't arrest them for being brown, so you could arrest them for what they were smoking. And we get our first anti-marijuana laws, actually, in El Paso, Texas. I think it was 1907. I think that was about around the time. California had banned marijuana by 1913. They've gone through 100 years of prohibition. And, of course, the federal prohibition through the Marijuana Tax Act took place in 1937. But keep this in mind. When the Federal Marijuana Tax Act passed in 1937, all 48 states, there was only 48 back then, all 48 states had already banned marijuana in one way or another. There was another very famous excerpt that came from congressional testimony. This is in 1937. There's attributed to Floyd Baskett, who is the city editor of the Alamosa, Colorado Daily Courier. And this was in the federal record. This is in congressional hearings, right? Said, quote, I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. That's why our problem is so great. The greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons, most of whom show an enthusiastic or low mentality because of social and racial conditions. So, again, we get a lot of this coming from racism against the Mexicans. But it wasn't just the Mexicans that there was a problem with. Basically, anybody who was smoking pot, African Americans, Mexicans, and in this case, in a letter to the California State Board of Pharmacy in 1911, Harry J. Finger, that's his name, Harry J. Finger, was a member of the State Board of Pharmacy in California. He wrote this, quote, within the last year, we in California have been getting a large influx of Hindus, and they have in turn started quite a demand for cannabis indica. They are a very undesirable lot, and the habit is growing in California very fast. The fear is now that it is not being confined to the Hindus, but that they are initiating our whites into this habit. It wasn't so bad if it was just the Hindus. I mean, you start getting the white women hooked on the cannabis indica. Oh, you got a problem. Also, So this is basically where we end up in most people's minds, and this is where there needs to be a little more education in this, because the primary impetus, as I feel from a lot of people when they talk about this issue of the word marijuana, is racism. Yeah, it's racist. It's a racist word. It's a racist word used for racist purposes. But that's a little harder to comport when you learn a little the history of what was going on just south of the border. There was a book written by Isaac Campos, and it's a book called Homegrown: Marijuana and the Origins of Mexico's War on Drugs. Mexico actually banned marijuana in 1920, 17 years before the United States federal government passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And in Campos's book, he talks about how, in American newspapers, we had the degenerate Mexicans, the degenerate Spanish-speaking citizens, the Negroes that were smoking the pot and would go after the white women and so on. But this similar kind of demagoguery and propaganda against marijuana was also going on in the Mexican press. Very interesting things that they wrote here. In Campos's book, he talks about some Mexican newspapers and before 1900, right? Before 1900, containing similar details. Here's one: a soldier driven mad by marijuana and attacking his fellow soldiers. This is from El Monitor Republicano, 1878. Here's another story: a pot-crazed soldier murdering 2 colleagues and injuring 2 others. La Voz de Mexico, 1888. And a prisoner stabbed 2 fellow inmates to death after smoking up, from El País, from 1899. So this is kind of interesting to note that in the Mexican press, they were demonizing marijuana, and they were spelling it with an H, or actually a G, M-A-R-I-G-U-A-N-A, in the Mexican press. And this didn't really catch up in America till post-1900. You look in the LA Times, you look in the New York Times, you look at the historical record of some of these newspapers that go back into the 19th century, and you'll find that pre-1900, people talk about cannabis or they talk about hemp. They talk about cannabis as a medicine. They talk about hemp as an industrial textile. You won't find mention of the word marijuana or even stories about people using it recreationally as cannabis or Indian hemp or cannabis indica, or if there was any recreational mentions, it was always hashish. And that, dates back to, pre-19th century. The first few accounts you start to see using the word marijuana in the American press take place around 1900, 1905. We got this one 1905 Los Angeles Times story: delirium or death, terrible effects produced by certain plants and weeds grown in Mexico. So this is one of the first one. And in that story, here's one of the quotes: not long ago, a man who had smoking a marijuana cigarette attacked and killed a policeman and badly wounded 3 others. 6 policemen were needed to disarm him and march him to the police station, where he had to be put into a straitjacket. Such occurrences are frequent. People who smoke marijuana finally lose their mind and never recover it, but their brains dry up and they die, most of time suddenly. End quote. So this is all the way back to 1905, but again, still lagging behind the Mexican press that is denigrating this drug pre-1900. And so what we're finding here is on the Mexican side of the border, you're getting a denigration of marijuana because of class issues. Whenever they talked about in Mexico about somebody going nuts here, it was somebody that was, a soldier or a worker or, somebody who's of the lower classes using the marijuana. In America, it seems to be used in a racist way, but in a sense, it's really more of a class warfare if you look at it in the right perspective, because of the immigrants that were coming in to take jobs, the lower skilled jobs that were going on. And the mention earlier of the underworld whites, that there was part of the criminal class, part of the undesirable class. Now there's no denying racism is at the heart of a lot of that, but it's at some point, there's at some level in American culture, it's hard to separate class and race, being that the most of the people of color were in the lower classes. So we have this happening throughout the press in the early 20th century. Now, where did the word actually come from? That's what we want to get to here, and it's hard to actually discern the etymology of this word. We do know that the Spanish brought cannabis to Mexico to cultivate it for hemp. So that's, in the late 1400s, early 1500s. We know about that. But it's unlikely the Spanish that used it for psychoactive purposes. They were growing it just like the colonists in America in 1611 at the Jamestown colony. They're bringing it in for the industrial properties of it. Now, one of the theories as to the origin of the word marijuana comes from Chinese immigrants to Western Mexico. We have to understand that just as we had Chinese immigrants in America, helping to build the railroads, San Francisco and all that, they were also on the Mexican coast, the Mexican Pacific coast, and the Chinese words that could refer to the plant, ma ren hua. Now, ma is the generic term for all tall, reedy plants, hemp plants, bamboo plants, jute, sisal, and so on. Hua, I know that's another plant word. I'm not sure what ren is saying at first, I think, but ma ren hua might have become Spanishized into marijuana. Another theory is that it came from colloquial Spanish as a way of saying Chinese oregano. Mejor ana chino would be the Spanish term. Or maybe Angolan slaves brought to Brazil by the Portuguese carried with them the Bantu word for cannabis. The Bantu word for cannabis is ma kanya. Ma kanya. Yeah, ma kanya. There we go. Or maybe the term simply originated in South America itself as a blend of the Spanish girls' names Maria and Juana. And there are so many other, there's a loco weed is another, which is actually a whole different plant, astragalus, something like that. But there's a lot of theories as to where marijuana came from. But to me, the important issue for us now is the use of the word itself. And is the use of the word marijuana racist? I know a lot of people in our movement think so. And a lot of people, strive to say the word cannabis at all times. I have a general theory on this, and my general theory is this. Marijuana may have been used for racist purposes by racists to scare people into fearing the plant. But I don't believe that a word itself, absent context, can necessarily be racist. And in the case of marijuana, if it's a slang term for the flowering tops of cannabis plants that you then dry and smoke, I think it has a good purpose. Sometimes when people say, oh, we're smoking cannabis, I feel that's not quite accurate. That's too broad. I don't smoke stalks. I don't smoke leaves. I don't smoke seeds. I smoke cannabis buds. And if we can have a word for that, marijuana, why not use it? It doesn't have to be a racist word. I like cannabis as the name of the plant, its entirety. I like hemp as the name of a certain variety of that plant, grown specifically for an industrial purpose. I like the word marijuana for the flowering tops that are being used for recreational purposes or even medicinal purposes. And a lot of people disagree with me on this, and especially worldwide. Worldwide, it's cannabis. Marijuana is a very kind of American term. But there are some practicalities to take a look at this as well. When you're doing a Google search, you're going to get 10 times the hits on the word marijuana as you do on the word cannabis, because people think of marijuana and associate that specifically with the plant, with the use of the plant in a recreational manner. And I think by self-censoring the word marijuana, we give that word more power than it really has. We give to our opponents, we kind of imply that there's something bad about the recreational use of smoking cannabis, the flowering tops. And I know the idea is to try to reframe it by calling it cannabis, but if we're going to reframe, let's be accurate. And like I say, I don't smoke cannabis. I smoke some parts of cannabis. If we can have a word for that, I don't see what's wrong with it. And then if we talk about the other terms, pot, weed, and so forth, well, sometimes in a Twitter world or a headline world, characters matter. Marijuana has 9 letters, pot has 3. If you're trying to get 140 characters into a headline or into a tweet, pot can be a whole lot more useful. And again, in America, pot's going to get you more hits than cannabis does. So let's just find a way that we can deal with this word. If you don't like particularly using it, that's fine. But don't jump all over other people that use the word. They're probably not using it in a racist sense. We're not Harry J. Anslinger or Harry J. Finger, for that matter. We know that when we say marijuana, we're talking about the buds that we smoke and the friends that we smoke it with. We can take this word for ourselves and disarm it of all of its racist past. Well, that's all the time we got here for Hour 1. Stay tuned for Hour 2. We got some special video from Brian the Red from the Justice for Trayvon Martin rally in Nopo. That's North Portland for those out-of-towners listening. Also, we've got Left Wing Larry hanging out in the studio. We might talk to him just a little bit on his first week in Portland, Oregon. The good, the bad, and the ugly. For Brian the Red, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for Hour 2. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.